And here is everybody arriving. Not sure if we have all of the participants yet, but I'll give them a couple of minutes just to come in. So welcome everybody to what's going to be an introduction to pricing custom font work. And the kind of format's generally going to be just me talking, waving my hands around with some very basic slides, and then changing over to some samples and some templates. The samples and the templates are going to be available to everyone. I will, since this is available to people, just watching the stream as well as the participants in the workshop, I'll post links to those afterwards in the Q&A on Discord, and I'll also email the links to the participants. So I think we're just about ready to run. So I will share my screen. So welcome and greetings from Canada, where today is the first of a new holiday, the National Day of Truth and Reconciliation. I just wanted to acknowledge that. It's a day for acknowledging the survivors and those who didn't survive the residential school system in Canada when the Canadian government, over a period of almost a century, abducted Indigenous children from their families and forced them into schools, most of them run by Christian churches and organizations, where they were, among other forms of abuse, punished for speaking their own languages. Since language preservation and helping people to communicate in their own languages is very much a concern of mine, I wanted to begin by acknowledging that, and also letting you know that I'm speaking to you from the traditional territories of the Snuneymuxw First Nation, just off the coast of British Columbia. Oops. So let me begin by explaining why this workshop. So the immediate cause is that Erin McLaughlin kept pestering me in the nicest way possible that I should do something like this, and eventually I agreed to. But the other cause is that over the years, I've fairly frequently been contacted by colleagues asking me to help them come up with pricing for a project that they've been commissioned to do. And often this kind of comes up on a Friday afternoon where they say we need to get a quote to the client by Monday morning. By then it's very often, it's really too late to do a proper job. And the real message of this workshop is that you need to do a proper job in the pricing. You need to fully understand the project, and you need to cost out the individual elements so that both you and the client can be confident in the pricing that you're providing. Over the years, I've also had kind of candid conversations with colleagues, some of them quite experienced designers, and find out that they really don't have a good systematic way of doing their pricing, and they tend to kind of just pick numbers out of the air. Some of these numbers tend to be very low compared to what I think they should be charging. And generally people don't sort of talk about this. So I thought, well, let's try to talk about it in a way that will be helpful to type designers at various stages of their careers. Now, why is the workshop the way it is? So there have been attempts in the past to have conversations about pricing. It's not something that's taught, as far as I know, in any of the kind of MA program at Reading or The Hague or anywhere else that teaches type design. And so people kind of come out of the programs or come into the profession in other ways without good idea how to do pricing. So then they start asking around, how do people price stuff? And generally those conversations don't go anywhere. So this, right back to the old Typophile forum, there are attempts to start discussions there. Similarly on type drawers, and I know Erin and Aaron Bell tried to start similar discussions on Discord, and they tend to sort of fairly quickly peter out. And I think the reason for this is that people start asking, well, how much do you charge? What they want to know dollar amounts. And there are, fairly good reasons why people don't like talking about dollar amounts. And one is that although this is a very collegial business where we all tend to kind of know each other and like each other. We are also competitors, and competitors don't tell each other what they're going to charge for work because it allows people to undercut them. So that's one aspect of it. The other aspect, I think, is actually that quite a lot of people are embarrassed by not really having a good idea how to go about pricing things, especially if they've been in the business for quite a long time. They don't want to kind of admit that they don't really know how to price stuff. So the way the workshop's going to be, the approach I want to take with the workshop is not really to talk about dollar amounts, although I will kind of show you some examples, including dollar amounts. But the approach I want to take is to give you tools to think about pricing, and methods to come up with pricing and to cost a project, so that you can kind of take those away and then apply them to the particular kinds of projects that you're working with, the particular kind of clients you're working with, and adapt this to your particular situations. And and towards the end of the session, hopefully we'll have time for some questions. And if you do have questions that relate to your particular situation, I'll try to help with those. But of course, everybody's situation is slightly different. The goal of this approach is to come up with what I call confident pricing, where you are able to cost a job in such a way that you are confident going into a discussion with the client that the pricing is right. And that allows you to be confident. It also allows the client to be confident. And I've been in situations where a client has come to me, particularly in the early days of when I was kind of learning this stuff myself, actually where a manager for one company I was doing some work with came to me off the record and said, "You're not charging enough," and they were having concerns about my ability to do the work based on how little I was charging them, and they wanted to be confident that that they could trust me to do the work, to do it to deadline, and part of that confidence would come from having a price that was in line with what they were expecting to pay. What is custom font work? So talking here broadly about commissioned font work. So this is work that a client is coming to you, wanting you to do for them. It's rather than type design that you're developing speculatively with the hope of selling, whether to someone or via licensing to end users. The extent of this kind of work can be everything from a complete font family, which obviously is the most exciting and interesting form of custom font work. It can also involve things like extending, adding new weights or new styles to an existing family. So sometimes someone will come to you and say, "I really like your typeface X, but do you think you could do a black weight?" And so even though it's your type family that maybe they're licensing, it's considered custom work in that it's work that you wouldn't be doing unless they were going to pay you to do it. Another good example is adding a script or language extension to an existing font. And sometimes that's your own font. Sometimes a client will come to you with a typeface that they already own. Sometimes a typeface that they've licensed from somebody else and they want it extended. Obviously, if they've licensed it from somebody else, you need to go to the original foundry and ensure that the license allows the client to commission this kind of work. Sometimes we will go to a client. A client will come to us asking us to extend the font. We go to the original foundry and say, "Here's this thing. Here's this client. This is what they want us to do. Are you willing to allow us to do it?" And then we come in a kind of a three-way agreement where they look after the licensing and we do the work. So all that's going to be examples of what I mean by custom font work. The pricing model that I'm going to give you is something that can apply to any part of that or any kind of that sort of thing, and also to other kinds of technical work. So even if someone comes to you and says, "We've got a font, but it's not as good as we want it to be. We just want it tidied up, or we want some kerning added, or some hinting, or some open type layout programming," the same kind of general approach to pricing can be applied. So I want to start by talking about understanding value. So broadly speaking, there's two kinds of value in fonts. And that is the value of the labor that you as the type designer and the font maker put into the font. And then there's the value that the user gets out of the font. It's good to understand both aspects of that value and to build your pricing around those two different kinds of value. The it's helpful in that the general model that we have of fonts actually kind of allows us to split those two different kinds of value into two different kinds of fee structures. So one is the fee structure for the work itself, and the other is the fee structure for the licensing of the use of the fonts. And that licensing can be very, very varied, from everything from uh, completely transferring all of the rights associated with the fonts to the client, i.e. they're buying out the font, they want it for their own private use and you're going to have no further involvement with it. Or it can be something where they want it to be exclusive for a period of time, or all they care about is that they have it and they don't care if you're licensing it to other people. There's also the case of a company such as Google and Google Fonts paying you to release it under an open source license or a Libre license of some kind. So those are all related to the value that the user or the client gets out of the font, and that's separate from the value that you put in terms of your labor. So the way I kind of like to set up my project quotes is that I figure out what it's going to cost me to do the work, and fully kind of costed in detail, accurate, confident price on that. And then separately from that will be the pricing of the license of the rights to the intellectual property, and that can vary a lot depending on which rights the client wants. Sometimes it's difficult to really get a sense of what the value the user is going to get out of the font. So, if you're making a font that's going to be used by a company for its branding, for example, that can be very substantial value to, depending on the nature of the corporation, how established existing brand is, how the new typeface fits into it, that sort of thing. If they are wanting a font, say, to bundle with a piece of software, you can't always have a sense of how much value that implies in a dollar sense. If you're doing a font that's going to be released under a Libre license, you really can have no idea at all of the overall value that the font is going to have for everybody who uses it. As Dave Crossland at Google said to me, it tends towards infinity, and therefore your ability to kind of put a dollar value on it tends actually towards zero. So although you can't always understand the value that a user is going to get out of it, it's obviously helpful to have some idea so that you can start figuring out what kind of price to charge for the rights of usership that they're going to have on the fonts. And then obviously you should really have a very good idea of the value of the labor that you're putting into it. So that leads me to establishing a baseline. So a lot of this comes down to general and basic financial literacy. And I don't have a lot of time today to kind of go into that kind of financial literacy. There are a lot of good online resources. The lettering artist, Jessica Hirsch, did an excellent workshop on the dark art of pricing. And she has materials from that available on her website, and I'll provide the link to that in the Q&A, because they are well worth getting hold of. And it includes materials kind of very specific to the creative industries in general, although not specifically to font development. the idea of the baseline is that you need to have some idea of how much money you need to live, and that's going to provide the baseline by which you'll be able to look at any project that a client wants you to do, and figure out whether or not it's viable for you to do the project, i.e. is it going to generate enough money for you to live. And living isn't just surviving. Living is figuring out how you want to live, what that's going to cost, and also within that context, are you able to plan for the future, or are you just kind of living project to project? And particularly for freelancers working alone, there is a tendency to live project to project, and that's kind of works okay when you're young and when you're first starting out. But trust me, as time goes on, you need to be able to also plan for the future. You need to have a model that allows you to put some money away, to have some savings. And it's also not just your living, but it's your ability to conduct a business. So there's, as well as your living expenses and your rent and your food and all that sort of stuff, you need to have a good idea of how much things like incorporation is going to cost, your corporate taxes and personal taxes coming off a project, what they're going to be, legal fees. You're going to be working with clients. You should be working under contracts. You're going to want to have a lawyer to review the contracts. Quite often, a particular client that has no prior experience in commissioning font work, will ask you to draft the contract. So you need to kind of build that into your quotes as well, and know kind of what it's going to cost you to have a lawyer assist in that process to review and advise on your contracts. So once you've established a baseline, then you've got an idea of how much money, as an absolute minimum, each project is going to require, but relative to the amount of time you estimate that it's going to take you. So the first step of quoting on a job is to understand what the job is, because you can't put a price on a thing until you really know what the thing is. I do get potential customers coming to me sometimes sort of out of the blue, saying, we're thinking of commissioning a font, how much will it cost? And that's kind of as far as they've thought in the process. That's not enough to price anything, obviously. So the process of developing a quote, which comes along with a proposal, involves developing both a design brief and a technical spec for the project. And I like those to be as detailed as they can possibly be. So the beginning of the process is usually to ask a lot of questions of the client, and if they've never kind of commissioned a font before, they won't necessarily know the answers to a lot of the questions. So you kind of need to ask the questions in a way that will get them to think about what they need, because if all they've gotten as far as is the idea, oh, we think we might want a font, they haven't really thought about what they need and what they want. And so you need to start asking them questions, things like, do they have a character set in mind? If they don't have a character set in mind, are there specific languages that they're targeting? What font formats do they want? Do they, want a CFF OpenType, a TrueType font? Do they want both? Do they want you to provide web fonts as well? So just figure out what formats you're going to be delivering. What's the intended deployment of the font? So is this something they're going to be using as a web font? Is it something they're going to use internally in their organization? Is it going to be specific to a small part of the organization? So, for example, maybe they have a in-house design firm, or they have, they're working with exterior design agencies or branding agencies, and it's only going to be a relatively small group that's going to be using the font. Or is it fonts that they're going to put on their corporate networks and are going to be available to everyone in the organization? Is it something they're going to bundle with some software? A lot of the work we've done over the last 25 years has been for companies like Microsoft and Adobe and Apple, where they're wanting the fonts and they're going to be shipping them with Windows or with Mac OS. And so understanding how they're planning on deploying the fonts is very useful. Are they going to be using the fonts with specific software? And this is a question I always ask, particularly if it's say a client like a media company. We're doing some work with a media company at the moment, and having a list of the software that they're going to be using it in, including the versions of the software and the platforms they're going to be using it on. That's very, very helpful, especially when it comes time to testing. And often, so for example, we're doing some work at the moment with a television broadcast news organization, and they are going to be using it in the kind of ticker table on the bottom of the screen. They're going to be using it in the kind of animated graphics that they'll be using in charts and stuff during news broadcasts. And so we need to know what is all the specialized software that they use for things like the ticker tape. And then I go off and investigate those before I even tell them whether I can do the job for them. Because, if they're using some very ancient piece of software that, say, isn't Unicode, isn't OpenType, that might be something that either we can't build for them, or is going to require a whole different workflow from what we would normally do. So figuring out the design brief, do they have something in mind for the design? Obviously, if it's a branding company and if they're working with a branding agency, they might already have a kind of idea they want the direction of the design to go in. Some cases, they'll have a fairly vague notion of the design. They'll come and say, we want a very clean and neutral sans serif, like everybody else. And so you've got to then kind of tease out of them more information about what that might look like, in terms of the design language perhaps that they're using elsewhere in their identity. And you kind of work that up into a design brief alongside of the technical spec. I always approach the technical spec as a spreadsheet. And the spreadsheet is based around a glyph set. So because fonts are very glyph-centric objects, defining the glyph set is one of the best ways to approach the technical spec. So this is a sample of a very simple glyph set for a pan-European Latin font with a bunch of OpenType layout stuff. So basically, it's a glyph index, the Unicode mapping, just a visual reference, so I kind of know what I'm looking at. The development name, the names that I use in the font, in my kind of font sources when I'm working in FontLab or glyphs. The post name is what kind of goes into the font itself, where that's different. And then possibly the most important thing is this column here, which is the category. So at a minimum, you want to categorize the glyphs as either base glyphs or composites, because the costing of creating a base glyph is obviously going to be higher than the cost of creating a composite. In some of my projects, I also have the simple category, and a simple category is a glyph that is not technically a composite, but is something that's very easy to produce. So obviously something like the space glyph, design-wise, I need to spend time carefully figuring out how wide the space glyph should be for a particular weight and width, etc. But because I'm not actually designing an outline in it, it's something I classify as simple. Some projects I'll only do base and composite, but quite often I'll do the simple as well. And then you have all your diacritics. Most of them are composites. We have some unencoded variants. Got notes, some of them might be only in italic styles. So basically, you're kind of figuring out, even before you set down to work on the font itself, figuring out at the quote stage what the glyph set's going to be. Now, there may be some unknowns in here. The glyph set is a working document. So once you've gotten the contract and you start the project, you maintain this. And if you add glyphs, you remove glyphs, you keep updating this. But before the project, you should have a pretty close idea to what the glyph set is gonna look like. And some small caps, combining marks, punctuation, small cap punctuation in this case, raised case things. If I'm doing a project for what would be classified in Unicode terms as the complex script, so something like Arabic or one of the index scripts, obviously then this can be a lot more extensive, involve a lot more unencoded variants, ligatures, half forms, and then I tend to expand this horizontally as well and start noting information about which OpenType layout features a glyph is going to be activated by. Maybe if a feature is going to be contextual, I'll start documenting what contextual groups the glyphs belong to. But this here is a kind of very basic introductory and simple sample, and I'll provide the links for that. So the purpose of kind of doing that work up front is to then be able to use that information about the glyph set to develop accurate development costing. So a lot of the key work that goes into a font is obviously the design of the individual glyphs, the creation of the outlines, the spacing of the outlines, and because that's kind of glyph centric, once you've done a glyph set spreadsheet, then you know how many base glyphs you're dealing with, how many composites, and you can start assigning costs on a per cost basis, a per glyph basis, rather than just trying to kind of estimate the amount of time that you think something might be going to take you. And again, the goal here is to have confident pricing, or what you might call justified pricing, where every dollar that you quoted to the client, you can justify to yourself and, if necessary, justify to the client in terms of the amount of work that's actually involved. So this is a template of a kind of spreadsheet that I use to actually cost a project. And the idea here is that the project is broken down into as many individual discrete work items as possible. This is typical of what I will do. You might be able to break it down into further steps, or you might combine some of these steps in kind of whatever way kind of makes sense to you. Basically, this spreadsheet involves a bunch of formulas in the cells that allow you to fill in quantities in the green fields, a per unit cost in the yellow fields, multipliers in the blue fields, and then in the orange field, you're going to select from a number of possible options. At the top, you have the actual font. So or sometimes I would do this as masters. So basically it's figuring out how many master weights you're going to need to create. What are you actually going to have to design from the ground up? And then often a project will involve derived fonts. So generally I will not charge the same amount for an interpolated weight. So let's say I'm doing a project and I think I'm going to design a light master and a heavy master. I'm going to interpolate a regular master. That regular master might need, some work done on it to get the actual kind of what I want for the regular weight in terms of the balance of thick and thin strokes, and so I will, be charging something for that work, but it won't be the same amount as I'll be charging for the extremes that I'm starting with. In terms of work items, I didn't used to include project planning as a work item. I've started doing it recently because this whole process I'm describing to you of working with a client, going through the process of figuring out what it is that they need, coming up with the glyph set, it can take quite a long time. And so you either build cost for that into other areas of the pricing, or you can create a project planning thing. So this would be something that gets calculated into the price, but it's essentially for the work that you're doing in order to come up with the price. Contracting is, if a client wants you to be the person who comes up with the contract for the project, it's going to take you time to draft a contract. You're going to pay some legal fees to have a lawyer look it over. Chances are they're going to have their lawyer look it over. They might come back to you requesting changes. So that whole process is going to, cost you time and probably legal fees. And so you want to recoup that. Design proposal stage, generally, this is something we do at the kind of first stage after contracting, which will be somewhere 10 to 15 glyphs in a couple of weights to show the direction in which we're planning to take the project. And usually, there's some iteration on that where we'll, show it to the client, and if they, they like it and they sign off and they're great, go ahead. We do that. Otherwise, they might, say that, there are things about it they don't like. So there might be a couple of rounds of iteration in that. Source setup is simply getting the project ready to go underway. So getting the information about your glyph set into your font software. Generally this stuff doesn't take very long nowadays, but if you're doing things like setting up variable axes, it can take a couple of hours worth charging for. Then you've got the actual glyph creation. So your base glyphs, your simple glyphs, and your composite glyphs. And that's generally going to be per font. And I've got in square brackets here, review. So if you're working, say, on a script extension, you might have script experts you work with. So for example, if I'm working on a Cyrillic typeface, even though I've done a lot of Cyrillics over the years and I'm fairly confident doing them, I still hire Maxim Zhukov as a script expert to advise me on the design, and we'll have an iterative review process. So knowing how much that's going to, Maxim's going to charge on a project, then I can include that in the cost. Kerning, obviously, everybody's favorite topic. G-sub and GPOS, I tend to do separately. So open type layout programming. The reason I do this separately is that sometimes, depending on the project, the only GPOS might be the kerning, and you've already done that. So GPOS here would be things like mark positioning, and particularly for complex scripts where you get into contextual mark positioning and you're writing fairly complex open type layout code, or creating complex lookups in a visual tool. You want to price those up separately. Mastering is basically the process of actually being able to produce a font. So you've got all your sources, and mastering might be as simple as hitting an export button in a font tool. It may be a lot more complicated than that, depending on the nature of the project that you're doing. And you should have some idea of kind of how much time it costs each time you do that process. And obviously you're trying to get it to a process where it's it's not something that's going to take you hours to do every time you need to do a new font. And then obviously testing. So you want to be able to send the font to the client, knowing that it's going to substantially work for them. At the same time, I usually give clients in the contract 60 days to get back to me with bug reports that I will fix at no additional cost. And those will be bugs just against the brief and the spec as outlined in the contract. So if I've got an error in my G-sub, for example, where some ligature isn't working properly, that's something hopefully I catch. If they catch it, I want to encourage them to get using the font and testing the font, and not come back to me, say 6 months down the road or even a couple of years down the road to say, oh, we found something wrong in the font. So generally I say 60 days. The fact is, if it's 90 days, it's, you know, however long after. If it's not a big thing, I won't charge them to fix it. But you know, you should not leave yourself open to be doing endless maintenance on a font for years down the road at no cost. These are all set up to be charged at units, and so some of them are flat fees. A lot of them obviously are going to be per glyph. So you know, we're going to, you know, say how many glyphs, how many base glyphs, how many simple glyphs, how many composite glyphs. I tend to quote other things on a day rate. Now, the other way you can do it is at an hour rate. You know, so figure out based on your baseline, based on how, you know, how much time you think each of these tasks is going to take you, and that's something you only know through experience. You know, so, and there's that irony that if you're a beginner, things are likely to take you longer. And if you're more experienced, they're going to take you less time. But in terms of being able to, what you're able to charge a client is going to be less if you're a beginner and more if you're experienced. And so the kind of, you know, the idea is that your hourly rate or your day rate goes up as you proceed in your career, even though the amount of time some of the tasks are taking you goes down. Not all of the tasks. Some tasks like kerning, you know, it's always going to take the time that it takes. And then the rights transfer section. So that is what allows you to then, so, you know, this section up here of the work items, that's the value of the work that you put in to the font. The rights transferred, the rights type is trying to get, you know, an appropriate stake for yourself in the value that the client is going to get out of the font. And typically the way that will work is some kind of exclusivity in the use of it. So, you know, you know they're going to be using it for branding, and that will give you some idea of what to, you know, but if they want complete ownership of the font, that's going to cost them more than if, say, they wanted exclusivity, but only for, say, 5 years or 3 years, after which you'd have the rights to license the font to other customers. Or, you know, they might only be interested in having the font, and they don't care if you're, you know, immediately going to be also licensing it to other people. The idea is that there's always something that the client is paying for rights distinct from the work that you're doing. You know, you're not just selling your labor. You know, unless something is contract is specifically a work for hire. You know, if somebody comes to you and say, we have our own font, we own it, we need you to add a bold weight. That could be something that's done just as a work for hire contract. In that case, you're just being paid for your labor. But if you're creating something new for a client, you are creating intellectual property that has value. And you should be being paid for that intellectual property value as well as the work that you're doing. And the way I generally do that is by setting up a multiplier that takes the total development fee from all the work and multiplies it by some factor here to give the cost for the different kinds of rights that are possible. And obviously there may be other kinds of rights that I've not included in this sample, you know, and you can sort of figure out, you know, what kind of figure you want to put on that. So having explained the template, let's look at an example of what a costed project might actually look like. So in this one, we're assuming 4 base fonts, i.e. 4 base master designs. So that might be something like a light and a heavy in both a Roman and an italic. And the cost, the multiplier on that is 1. So, you know, everything that happens in the work is going to be costed at 1 for those base fonts. But maybe we're going to do some derived interpolated weights, and they're going to be at 0.75. That's actually quite high for an interpolated weight. That's presuming quite a lot of work is going to need to be done, and you would determine that based on the nature of the design. So if you've determined that the interpolation between light and heavy needs something in the middle to anchor the axis, then and that is going to need quite a lot of manual work. Then you might do something like 0.75, 0.8 to kind of cover that amount of work. Project planning. So this is actually the pricing for something like that pan-European Latin set that I have in the sample glyph set spreadsheet. So I'm assuming something like 2.5 days of consultation with the client, coming up with a proper design brief, writing up the proposal and the quote, making the glyph set spreadsheet, and doing all that. So something like 2.5 days. I've not done anything for contracting in this particular example. So let's say maybe you're doing it for someone who already has a contract for this kind of work. Design proposal, 4 days. So I'm presuming spending probably 2 of those days coming up with the initial design, and then a couple of days of iteration. Source setup, I've just done it like 0.2 days. Not a big project, not a really complicated design space. So that can be done fairly quickly. But I was also including things like filling in all the metadata in the source. So finding out from the client what trademark names and stuff might be involved, and getting all that sort of stuff into the font sources. For this project, we have 95 base glyphs, 11 simple glyphs, and 187 composites. And again, that's derived from the sample spreadsheet I came up with. It's a Latin font. I'm not employing a reviewer, so nothing for the reviews. For a Latin font, I tend to spend on kerning 1 day per style. Actually, I can bump that up to 4 days. So, because I'm beaming up. So on each of the extreme masters, possibly some, then interpolate the kerning for the others. So, figuring out kind of how much time the kerning is going to take you, that's going to be relative to the overall size of the glyph set. If you're dealing with multiple scripts, obviously it's going to get a lot more complicated, take a lot longer. But for a fairly basic Latin font, I generally do 1 day for each style, each master. Again, it's a Latin project. It's fairly simple. I'm doing half a day for G-sub. The nice thing about G-sub is that, if you've already done one Latin font, you've probably got most of the G-sub code that you need in an existing project. Just because you've already created something doesn't mean the client gets it for free. You charge the client for everything that they're getting. Even if it's something you're leveraging work that you've already created elsewhere, either in a template or in another project. In this case, the only GPOS going into the project is kerning, so there's no additional stuff there. Mastering, I'm just giving myself 0.2 days. I'm guessing that during the course of the testing and the iteration, I'm probably going to be going through this process a few times. It's not a big deal in a project like this. If it were something, for a complex script where I might be merging from multiple different tool sources, say, doing the design in one tool, doing the OpenType layout in another, that can take a lot longer, be more complicated, and every time I need to go through that process takes time. And then testing for a simple font like this, I'm guessing 1 to 2 days. So here I've done 1.5 days. I'm just that's going to be things like making sure the font's installed correctly, checking the interpolations, make sure there aren't any things where glyphs are turning inside out because the start points don't match. Test settings in text, spacing and kerning tests. So generally, by for each project, you're gonna generate test documents and have those ready to go. And those you can reuse during this process. So generally, I don't charge the client for creation of the test documents, but I do for the time that I am creating the individual tests and then reviewing them. And then once I've done that, then I'm filling in down here in the yellow the per unit cost. Now these are not dissimilar to what I might charge for a project, but they're not necessarily exactly what I would charge for a project. And the other thing is that these things do tend to vary a little bit depending on the nature of the project, the complexity of the design. If somebody wants me to do a complex display typeface, which is not something I do very often, but something kind of big and swashy with elaborate ornaments, for example, the per unit cost is going to get higher. If someone wants geometric sans serif, the per unit cost is going to go down relative to the amount of time it's going to take me to create each glyph. With some kind of hourly rate in my head. So if I'm presuming that I'm able to do 2.5 to 3 base glyphs per hour on average, I can figure out what the per base glyph cost is going to be. Simple glyphs charge less. Composites, I still charge something for composites, even though nowadays with anchor positioning in font sources, it's possible to kind of build a lot of the composites on the fly, but you still need to do the anchor positioning that's going to allow that to happen, and spend time checking them, etc. So I still charge something for the composites, and then a day rate. And so the reason I charge a day rate rather than an hourly rate, I think if I were kind of at the beginning of my career, I'd be more likely to charge an hourly rate to calculate this stuff. Partly because I would want to actually keep track of the hours I spend on a project and the different work items, so I can learn over time how accurate my estimates for time for things like kerning and stuff are. Because there's no point in saying, oh, I'm going to spend 8 hours kerning per master, and if you find it actually is going to take you 16 or 24 hours per master. So charging, calculating on an hourly rate is quite a good thing to do as you're learning this stuff. Some years ago, I moved to a day rate, and that's mostly because I like the fact that a day is a flexible concept. So there are days that are 8 hours long, and there are days that are shorter than 8 hours, and the days that are longer than 8 hours. But I have in my mind, a notion of a day in terms of the amount of work that I can get done in it. So once you've filled in these, and so you filled in the per unit costs and you filled in the quantities, these fill in automatically. So there is for the creation of the glyphs, there is a base font price. So a base glyph, the 95 base glyphs in each of the masters is going to be $3,800. That for the derived fonts, it's going to be that interpolated middleweight is going to be $2,850, and then this is the total for the 4 base masters and the 2 derived masters, and then the same obviously for the simple glyphs and the composite glyphs. These are the totals calculated from the number of days, and that gives a total development fee. So this is just the work itself of $56,090. So that's what the project is going to cost you in terms of what you estimate to be the amount of time that each of these individual work items is going to cost you. And the great benefit of breaking it down into the individual work items is that you can cost them all very specifically like this. And if in a future project you realize, oh, actually, the kerning took longer, or even the G sub took a lot less time than then you can adjust those individual work items. And it means that this number, this development fee here, isn't just a number that you've kind of pulled out of the air to quote to someone. as a kind of total, it's, you might, only quote them the total costs, but you can justify and have confidence in each of the individual work items that make up that cost. So then there's the rights transfer, or the exclusivity, or whatever kind of rights type that is going for. Now, you can approach that simply as a flat fee. So you can make that entirely independent of the development fee. I found it useful to quote it as a multiple. So I put some numbers in here. So a full rights transfer would be 3 times the development fee. I'm not saying that is always what I would charge for that. I've sometimes done rights transfers that were only 2 times the development fee. I've sometimes done it for quite a bit more than 3 times the development fee. The point is to kind of convey to you that this is a way of doing it. You can assign some numbers here, see what they come up to, and then obviously what you do is if a client is definite that they want full rights, so you've spoken with them before the contract regarding what rights they want, and they are adamant that they want to own the font outright. So any intellectual property associated with the font is going to be there. So then what you do is you would come in here and you would simply delete the other options, and that will give you your total price for the entire project. Typically what I do is I quote the development fee and the rights separately to the client. So in the quote, I will give them a cost for the work and a separate line item for the rights transfer. And I'll kind of go into the reason for doing it that way. So rather than quoting just a total where they won't necessarily know kind of what it is that they're paying for, I like to make it clear that they are paying for these 2 different things. They're paying for work and they're paying for rights. And then we come to the negotiating stage. So you've done your design brief, you've done your technical spec, you've priced out the work that needs to be done, and then you've written up a proposal. I like to do nice detailed write-up proposals. I like to do them as attractive PDF documents with as much detail as possible, explaining the nature of the project as I understand it based on our conversations. If I've done some like initial design sketches, I might include some illustrations in it as well, just to show what I have in mind. I will explain in detail how I'm going to do the work. Again, and that's building confidence with the client, so they can look at you and they can have confidence that you know what you're talking about, and that the price you've given them has been kind of justified and worked out relative to the work that you're explaining that you're going to do for them. And then you send off the proposal, and then they come back and say, we really want to go ahead with this project, but it's too much money. And that happens reasonably frequently. Because you've worked out the cost of the work items in this way, you should be fairly confident in that pricing. Now, obviously, you're beginning your career, you're kind of figuring out how much time things take you, figuring out what you might charge for them. It's going to take you a while to develop that level of confidence in your own pricing. But if you go through the steps, you should be fairly confident about that development fee. So when you get to the negotiating stage, you do not touch the development fee. That becomes non-negotiable. That's just what it's going to cost to get the work done. So that means you negotiate on the rights. So you negotiate on the rights usage. So sometimes, a client will come back to us and say, we really want to go over the project. We can't afford what you're charging for the rights transfer. So then I say, do you really need to own this project? Some clients, they just have it in their head that they're paying for a thing, they want to own it. They haven't really thought about what ownership means. They don't really have a need to own it. It's just, well, they're going to pay money, so they should own it. So sometimes the negotiation takes the form of me saying, well, do you need to own it? Maybe you only need it to be exclusive, and maybe you only need it to be exclusive for a period of time, and therefore we can offer them different rights, and thereby lower the price on the rights. Um, Sometimes they will say, no, we definitely want to own it, and sometimes they got good reasons for that. But they just say they can't afford it. Often in a situation like that, I like to ask them what's their budget. Um, do they have a counter offer? Sometimes they will come back with what looks to me like a reasonable kind of budget, um, and it might be less than I would want to charge, but it's not outrageously low. And particularly if it's an interesting project or it's something I want to do, um, you know, I'll say, yeah, okay, we can go ahead. Sometimes they'll come back and it's clear that they're haggling. They come back and say, well, actually, our budget is only this amount, and you look at it and say, yeah, no. So then you go back with a counter offer and you say, well, no, I can't do it for that low, but and you stress to them the value of what they're getting. You stress to them the intellectual property that they are getting, and the value that they're going to derive from it over time in the particular uses that they have in mind for it. And you know, then I say to them, I could do it for this amount. And generally, that's the point at which most of the time, that's the point at which they will agree on. The budget wasn't the budget. They do in fact have more. Um, Sometimes you'll get into a situation where they say, we can't afford it, and you go through this process of them saying what they would like to pay, you saying what you would be willing to do it for, and they still say, no, sorry, we can't afford it. There's But they're still adamant that they want a particular set of rights, and they're not going to change the kind of rights that they're going to get. So at that point, you're either walking away from the project or you're finding another way to be flexible. And one of the other ways we found to be flexible is to defer payment. So a big project we're doing at the moment, it's quite a long project. The project itself is going to take a little more than a year. Uh, the fees for doing the work are going to be paid over the course of that year, but the fees for the rights transfer are going to be paid over a 3-year period. And so basically, it allows the client to split the payment over 3 financial years, so that rather than trying to get it all out of the budget for 1 year, they're able to split it and plan the budget for the upcoming years. So that's the kind of thing you can fall back on. Obviously, is not ideal, but it's a position you can be in. And so long as you've priced the work itself confidently in a way that is going to pay you for the time you spend doing it, you don't really need to worry about defer payment on the licensing rights, because you're going to be paid for the work that you're doing and the time that you're doing it. And so you're going to be able to live during the time you're working. What you never want to do is get into a situation where you're doing the work for less money than you need to live, where you're deferring payment that includes the money that you need to live during the time that you're actually doing the work.
Hi everyone, I'm Pedro Sosa. I'm from Mexico City, and well, this is my talk about Enrico Martínez, the sixth printer in America and in Mexico City. The talk is going to be in two parts. The first part is all the historical information, the context, and the second part is about the revival type, the process of the revival. Well, let's start. Enrico Martínez was a multi-faith celebrated man in the 16th and 17th century in Mexico, in el México novohipano. He was born in Netherlands in the mid of the 16th century. He studied in various European cities. It is believed that it was in Sevilla where he discovered the beautiful art of print. He arrived to Mexico near to the end of the century, where he served as a cosmographer for Felipe II. And what was the task of a cosmographer? He had the task of informing about the new lands and territories that were discovered by the Spanish, the the travels and defeats of the arm of the army here in Spain, as well as the geography and stars movement in Mexican territory. But well, what we will note here is his activity as a printer, as a punch cutter, something that he began doing by chance. Enrico was also a translator of the Inquisition. As I mentioned before, he was a multi-faced man. So well, around those years, the end of 16th century, another printer was prosecuted due to his Lutheran ideas. The other printer was Cornelio Cesar Adrian. He was punished in the Tlatelolco convent, and he had to give up all his printing tools, such as his wooden press that he says that he made himself, and of course his mobile types. Everything came to possession of Enrico, and that's how he established his own prints. All well, Cornelio kept printing in Tlatelolco, but could never had a print of his own. He was the last man that worked with all the material from 16th century, with all the printing material uh, from Mexico. Okay, well, so Enrico opened his print almost at the end of the century in 1599 with a religious print called El Compendio de las Excelencias. Is this? This is the cover of the Compendio de las Excelencias that was written by Fray Juan Bautista, as we can see here. And well, we can see the colophon that says en la imprenta de Enrico Martínez, intérprete del Santo Oficio de la Inquisición, año de 1599. Well, this is the first print that Enrico made, and is the last print of 16th century in Mexico and well in all America. And well, okay. From Martinez print came a lot of notable works, even if they weren't editorial masterpieces. Keeping in time, in 1606, he prints one of his most memorable works, a book called El Repertorio de los Tiempos is this El Repertorio de los Tiempos de 1606. It is important because it is believed that for this book he carved a specific typography and some ornaments, and it is important because this is my original material where I revival my project of revival type. It's the original material here. Okay, so after in 1609, Enrico put his print on hold to focus on Mexico City's drain. But his press kept working 2 years after, thanks to his foster son Juan Ruiz. Enrico dies in Christmas in 1632. Well, during his life, he made several typographic fonts, 5 finished and 2 unfinished. The unfinished fonts, one has just the lowercase and the other just some uppercases. He carved also 2 frames that he used like capital letters. I have some example here. Well, just the revival character. I think it's here. It's like this. This character that function. I mean, all this it's a single character, and you can put inside the letter what you want, and you obtain a capital letter. Okay, so he also engraved some ornaments. Well, he never was a master punch cutter, but he did have a high aesthetic sense that allowed him to get better with each typography. This is his mark as print. As we can see, this is a page from El Repertorio de los Tiempos. It's, if you note, it's the same as here. It's a ornamental character that it include my font, the revival. So well, Enrico engraved seven fonts. The three first fonts that are there are here. This is the first, the second, and the third. The only italic that he finished. These third typographies were asked for Cornelio Cesar Adrian, the other printing. As I mentioned, Cornelio had the intention of put his own print, to establish his own print, and he asked to Enrico these 3 fonts. As we can see at the end, Enrico kept the fonts because Cornelio was punished, and well, all the material keep to Enrico. So well, just like examples, this is the first font that Enrico made, the second, the third, and the fourth. Well, the fight font was the main one, the first one in his own style. It's about 14 points nowadays. It's used for books in Nahuatl language mainly. And well, let's focus in the process of the revival. This is the some samples from the revival. The first that I made was to look and study Enrico's 7 fonts and decide that the 5 font was the best option for the revival, because as I mentioned, is the like the like the main font from Enrico, the 5, and is the only in his own style. So after that, I analyze the material, specifically the repertorio de los tiempos, el repertorio de los tiempos, and I have the chance to see this book, the original book, in the National Library here in Mexico City. It's a beautiful work. It's a beautiful print. Not the best from Enrico, but it's a good job. So I analyzed the book. I request some high quality reproductions and study every character. As we can see, for example, in here, I study, for example, a lot of Cs. All the material, all the material have to be in the same format, because if you change the format, the material, well, the original form could change, no? So when you do a revival, you have to focus just in one original font. I mean, like one original, I mean just one material, not to mix the materials. Okay, so I compare a lot of Cs and, well, each letter, just for put an example. I compare and select a few samples from each letter, and what I do was like tracing this form in almost exactly. But in this point, well, with these first samples, I got a catalog, like here in from each letter, and I start tracing the shapes as best as I could, and I got an initial product, an initial font. But that font was not the best, because the only thing that I do was trace analyze and trace the shape, the form exactly. But in this point, I realized that a revival is not just to copy the form. A revival involves a lot of other things. For example, like to know the historical context, like to know what happened with that material, with the original material. Because if you know all that, all the context, you could analyze, and you could understand uh, more intimately the purpose of that font. I mean, like his original purpose. So, well, um, as I mentioned, I had that first product, but it was um, the shape were too rigid and didn't have this spirit of the original font. Didn't have, like the spirit, like the soul. So in this point, I decide to reinterpret the shapes, not to trace like literary, more like reinterpret, and to analyze all the other factors, the time that was made, the historical time when the phone was made, the some facts that happen for do this specific phone. So well, um, like I try to take the essence, like the spirit, and allow myself to correct some mistakes that Enrico had made in the original font. For example, the serif. If, as you can see, the serif here are very rude, maybe. So I do the serif with a touch of graceful. And for example, another thing was to uniform all the serif, to check the diagonals, to check the weights, um, make the serif more graceful, again, and redraw some characters. For example, the G, we can see here the G. It's like yeah, not a cool G. So the final G, it's another different from the original font, but there are the decision that we have to take to in order to have a good revival. Not a revival, I think, is not to, again, not to copy the literary form, but reinterpret the form. Okay, so well, here we have some examples, like it's just for in order to show the examples. Of course, here we have a lot of mistakes in the spacing, but well, it's just in order to show the original and the revival. And well, here we have some a comparison between the original font. This is the original, the uppercase, the original the lowercase original, the uppercase original, and some examples. And well, this is here we have the first version. We can see this version very rude, with not spirit, and in this other version, the second version, the final version, it's here like this and this. And well, I mean, we are on time, so I just want to show you some specimens. As you can see, I include a lot of ornamental characters. And well, that's all of my part. Here we have my contact if you have some questions. So thank you. See you.
Hi everyone, my name is Natalie Snodgrass. Today I'm going to be talking about research methodologies for designing in non-native scripts. I'll be going over some highlights in my research, a brief overview of background information, surveys, and interviews, which all leads up to a final framework that can guide a designer on the research process. So what are the questions that drove this research? First, how does one become prepared to design an effective and well-researched typeface in an unfamiliar script? And by unfamiliar, I mean one the designer cannot read or write in, maybe a script from a culture that they are not native to, or a script whose cultural context they are unfamiliar with. Second, how does the designer's understanding of the relationship between type and culture affect this research process? And third, does the use of traditional anthropological research methods increase the success of this design process? If so, to what extent? So here's an overview of the entire research methodology for this project, but today I'll be sharing some quick highlights from the secondary research, interviews and surveys, and then going over the final framework in depth. So to start off, typography is always a responsive environment, meaning that typographic form only has meaning when viewed within a culture, and it's constantly in response to different cultural contexts and individuals' perspectives. With that in mind, it becomes imperative to understand the community you're designing for and the nuances of its subcultures. Within cultural studies and related to the concept of cultural identity, we have the idea of the postmodern subject, that modern individuals have no permanent identity. It shifts as we age, with whom we associate, our interests, settings, and all cultural interactions. In this diagram called the web of identity, we can see all of the different cultural identities we as individuals have. This web of identity is what allows for rich typographic tradition and variation within every culture. Typographic form shifts with different cultural and sociological identities, and it can be used as an indicator of one or more of those identities. Within this work, it's also important to study the systems of production and consumption within the new culture. This diagram, called the systems of production and consumption, shows how artifacts pass through the different areas of a culture. So typography as an artifact that passes through production, consumption, regulation, representation, and identity, it carries with it only constructed meanings of culture that it picks up in each of these phases. We then investigate these areas of culture through anthropological acts like participant field observation, interaction with locals, visits to locality, interviews, and more, and variations on these methods can be seen across many areas of design research. I conducted interviews with 8 type designers who collectively have expertise in over 20 world scripts. The goal of these interviews, as well as the surveys that I'll discuss next, was to better understand how practicing multi-script type designers conduct research and become informed about writing systems. Additionally, how the different cultural structures surrounding typography influence their processes. One of the most important discussions in these interviews was on the limitations to the multi-script type design process. These are the types of roadblocks that a designer faces when starting a project in a non-native script. First, the pragmatic is a lack of access to or difficulty in acquiring reference materials. This can be especially difficult when dealing with minority scripts. Second, linguistic, which is a lack of background knowledge on the language for which the script is used. Third, the psychological is the designer's own preconceptions and unconscious biases on language, typography, and culture. And fourth is the methodical, wherein the designer may feel like they can treat the type design process as the graphic design process, when in fact these two are incredibly different. In the process of creating typefaces in a non-native script, interviewees noted that 90% of time is spent with research and only about 10% is spent actually designing. One is constantly referring back to their research and continuing with research throughout the design process. Next, this chart illustrates the type of resources participants used during their research in both the interview and survey results. The majority of respondents used forms of printed matter as their main source of research material, And you can see the least used forms of research materials are things like stone carvings, metal type or wood type. This can suggest that convenience and availability are important factors when gathering materials, but may also denote the reliability or trustworthiness of different sources over others. Overall, within all interview participants' process was this underlying structure going from open discovery and critical analysis onto designing. This allows for a thorough evaluation and synthesis of complex writing systems. Also, many participants noted the vital importance of learning how to write in the script that you are studying and to participate with traditional tools. This allows the designer to literally feel and experience the system of writing different from their own and break down some of their own preconceptions. And finally, all participants have conducted audience research where they maintain correspondence, test their work, or work collaboratively with native speakers, representatives, clients, or designers, which tells us that anthropological methods are an imperative tool in typeface design research. Next, a survey was conducted that had a total of 57 participants from over 13 countries and with expertise in 24 scripts. So when asked what are some of the arguments for and against designing in a non-native script, proponents stated that it can push the designer into new areas of typographic understanding. It can help the designer to better understand challenges facing other cultures, and it can present opportunities to help underserved groups. Skeptics really emphasized the large amount of commitment required for learning a new script properly and showed hesitation to impose an incomplete understanding onto communities that may have unforeseen consequences in the future. The most frequently used ethnographic research methods within the survey respondents is observation of type in use, followed by sharing of process with local readers or experts, and then field work or visits to locality. Respondents also feel the most comfortable designing in a new script once they're familiar with the script structure, and also when they have the ability to define shape group behaviors and the ability to recognize meaningful details in shapes. Overall, the goal of research in non-native scripts is to become familiar with how a script is adapted across different purposes and artifacts, and how these artifacts and their typographic representations are connected to that culture's identity and history. Most importantly, the underlying commonality of all this information, both interviews and surveys, is the participants have this notion of respect, that a designer is showing humility and sensitively responding to the nuances of a given script's cultural context and providing a typographic product that's accurate to the forms, history, and usage of the script. So all this information culminates in a final framework that presents a groundwork structure for designers looking to navigate the process of learning to design in a new script. Here we have the main framework diagram. As you can see, this framework takes a decentralized model where the designer can enter the process at whichever point their knowledge level necessitates. However, if a person wants to start from the quote-unquote beginning, it would be at script research and working their way around clockwise. It's also non-specific to any one script, allowing for anyone to utilize this process for any project. So you can see that it's broken up into 4 stages, including 3 stages for research: script, context, and client. So script research is research on the script's history, construction, and shape language. Context research is research on how the script is used and applied by that cultural group or community. And client research is research on the client brief and on the needs of that particular context. These areas are all investigated through 3 different research methods: observation, interaction and practicing, and critical analysis. And you can see these methods exist on the lines guiding across all subject areas. First, observation is any removed act of observation where the designer isn't physically interacting with this system of culture, but rather observing the use, application, or forms of the script. Second, interaction and practicing means any direct interaction a researcher may have with a script or a community, including interviews and soliciting feedback from readers or practicing to write in that script. And finally, we have the method of critical analysis, which highlights the fact that one must constantly be asking questions at every point of research. Why the forms are that way, why the people behave that way, how that script has evolved, etc. And to be hyper aware of all the processes they go through, analyzing their own questions, reactions, and perspectives. All this information then feeds into the design process, which in this framework is extremely simplified. We have these steps of concept, digitize, and test. Every script shares these design steps, but each script has their own idiosyncratic pattern with each phase. So this design step then feeds back into the research process in a never-ending, iterative, informative loop. And because each of these research areas, script, context, and client, are so complex in their own rights, we have supporting diagrams to help guide you through them. So first is script research. This diagram outlines the resources that a designer may pull on when researching the constructions and forms of a script. First, we can see printed matter, which includes artifacts like densely typeset documents that allow someone to understand the grammar, the spacing, the overall texture of a script. Or you could look at something like printed ephemera, which can act as a ground zero to the graphic design and type styling of a culture. Next is environmental resources, which is any typographic artifact that exists within the built environment. Things like vernacular typography, signage, or graffiti. Third is online resources, which is any digital reference. So Unicode charts and proposals can be very valuable to study, particularly for minority scripts where information is sparse. Open source font files can be useful, opening those up and studying the decisions that the type designer made. And finally, historical resources. When one needs to study the history of a script, they can look to manuscripts, traditional calligraphy, surfaces like moving type, engraving, stone carving, which all paint a story of the evolution of form. Next is context research. What are some points that need to be studied in relation to that culture and in relation to that culture's cycle of production and consumption, remembering the sociological discussion that was shared at the beginning of this presentation? This diagram outlines the areas of the cultural context that a designer should consider when researching typography. First is vernacular typography and graphic styles. What do these forms mean or suggest or signify, and why do they suggest those things? Next, forms and habits of written communication and audience reader habits. How do people write and read in that culture? Standards of technology usage, what types of technologies are available or are the norm in that culture, and how do they affect your font file and structure? System of document production, how are typographic artifacts created, shared, consumed? And finally, issues of colonialism in relation to type, how have other groups imposed their ways of thinking onto that script, and what effects has that had? This is a particularly important item to consider when thinking about that concept of respect for that community. How has the script and language been altered in the past? How has this affected the minute details of their typographic practices? And how do the answers to these questions inform your own design choices, behaviors, and investigations? And finally, we have the supporting diagram for client research. These questions should be asked in addition to all of the traditional client brief information. First, which languages need to be covered and how can the forms work cohesively while remaining true to their own culture and history? This is a basic question to any multi-script project and speaks to the base nature of multi-script practices. Next, what are the circumstances of the readers and how will that affect technical choices, i.e. font features, file size, etc. Don't take your own technological privileges for granted. It's important to recognize the resources available to that particular audience and how your font and typeface can fit into that community effectively and pragmatically. Which brings me to the next question. How can you exploit new technology to benefit the reader and the script? Are there creative ways you can use type design software to benefit this project, this audience, this community? For example, things like open type features, variable fonts, etc. And finally, what does your character set need to include? Are there language-specific glyph variations that need to be covered? Are there any particular dialects that require unique glyphs or variations? So just to take it back to the main framework, we can see how interconnected all of these elements of information are, how they all feed into one another. It's so important to understand the context of the typographic forms you're playing with, and the outlining of this process is the first step in thwarting any misinformation and allowing design to flourish. So I just want to leave you with one last thought, which was raised during an interview. Typeface design is a knowledge profession. Increasingly, being able to make a typeface doesn't distinguish anyone. The understanding of how to make a typeface that represents the needs of a community and captures a trend, that is what you build a career on. In all of the explored avenues of discussion on research, we can see that anthropological research methods are already used across many areas of typographic research. Without this type of research, there are large gaps that exist in a designer's understanding of native use, application, readership, and cultural context. It's in the recognition and the pointed application of these acts where the designer's new work can begin to flourish, and it's in the empathy and respect for cultures where the work is successful and lasting. Thank you for your time, and I just want to include this link below too if you're interested in reading the full research document. There's so much more in this process that I didn't have time to discuss today. Thank you.
Here's again. This is how Australians greet each other. It translates as "how's it going?", which is our way of saying hello. We blend our words together because, well, it's too hot to say them individually. Hi, I'm Wayne. I'm a type designer from Australia, and this presentation is about ABC Sans, the font you're looking at on screen right now. Let's get into it. The brief that was given to me to design this font was 13 pages long, so I've distilled it down to 3 main points here. Number one, how might the ABC create a coherent experience through identity and through typography so that people, no matter where they see ABC content, know that it's come from the ABC. Number two, how can this font help to create a uniquely distinguished identity for the ABC? And how can this font help to carry that identity through all content? And number three, how can this typeface help to reflect Australia's multicultural identity? So all of that's no mean feat for a simple font. On top of that, the font had to work on all possible devices at as many sizes as possible. And it also had to be more legible than basically any font in history. So yeah, a very big ask. So the first thing that I thought was, okay, if I need to design a font that represents Australia, let's look at other countries and fonts that represent them. Which is not an easy thing to do because fonts generally have not been designed to represent a country or a people. They tend to come to represent those things over time. So Helvetica, for instance, which is renowned for its precision and neutrality, and it is Swiss designed, and those could be very well considered cultural traits of the Swiss nation. On the right there, you can see the London Underground typeface at the top, and Gill Sands at the bottom in the BBC logo. The London Underground face was designed for that purpose, for London transport, but it's been in use for 100 plus years and has become so associated with London's transport system that it's kind of become associated with Britishness and become the quintessential British font. Gill Sands very much in a similar way because Gill Sands is originally a derivation of Johnston Sands. I also looked at international sporting events that had cultural references in them. So the obvious ones are things like World Cups and Olympic Games. For example, if you have a quick look across those, most people would look at those typefaces that say each country and say, well, yeah, they carry some cultural traits of those countries. But it's extremely difficult to define exactly what makes it Korean or Brazilian or Russian. If we look at the Brazilian one in the middle there, for example, Brazilian football, Brazilian soccer has long been known for its emphasis on individual flair and enterprise, very much more so than many other countries and regions around the world whose football might be, for instance, much more defensive or much more heavily structured. The Qatar one at the bottom right corner there of the upcoming World Cup is interesting too. It shows that sort of extended baseline on the T, which is an oblique reference to Arabic text and Arabic calligraphy without the text actually being in Arabic language. So having looked at all of these different countries in various fonts that kind of represent their regions or areas, my next step is to understand what the Australian voice is. What is the Australian national identity so that I can then try and find a way of representing that in a font. And in my research and my discussions with people, stuff like this invariably came up very quickly. It's known as the wide brown land, which is familiar to all Australians, but albeit very much a cliche, because Australia has large areas of desert. But imagery like this is not very representational because 80+% of Australia's population lives within a thin coastal strip around the eastern and southern side of the Australian continent. So imagery like this instead is much more representational and much more recognisable to all Australians. And looking through all of this stuff, I started to wonder, what is it that's common to all of these things? And then I looked at the sky at the top of that image and the sky at the top of the previous image as well. I just flip back so that you can see. And it's almost always sunny here in Australia. The sky is huge and open and enormous. So we have a very well-known author, Australian author by the name of Tim Winton, who writes about Australian identity a lot. And he had one quote from one of his books. The book was called Island Home. And the quote was, "Our impossibly open sky dwarfing everything," which I think is a very much an Australian thing. This sky defines much of our daily life. The sun beats down from it. We spend our time in the summer trying to avoid the heat of the sun, but we still live much of our lives in outdoor kind of settings. Tim Winton also said, "Australia remains a place with more land than people." So through this, I started to latch onto this idea of open space as a key kind of component of our national identity. And I started to wonder, how could I apply this in a typeface? So I eventually settled on generically a concept of this nature. I wanted to produce a sans serif font that had a wider than usual measure and had this sense of generosity of space around it. So you can see the width comparison between Arial and my drawings in the top line. But if you look at the bottom, I also had this intent to open up all the apertures as much as possible. Wherever there's an aperture, I wanted to try and keep it nice and open, so that letters carried this kind of subconscious sense of generous space, which I hoped Australians would identify with. This is the primary alphabet that I came up with as the original concept for this. Now, bearing in mind at this point, it's just a set of vectors. It's not typable yet, and I have yet to actually get it approved by my client, which is what this image refers to. This was the day of my presentation meeting at the ABC's offices in Sydney. Now, I took this photo while we were waiting for one of the senior managers to come from another meeting and sit in on my presentation. You can see the projector on the right hand end of the table there. So my job was to stand there, and I had about 20 minutes to present my idea in but much the same way as I've just shown you, but in more detailed. And just as I was about to start my presentation, the two guys on the left there with the camera, they looked at me and said, "Oh, by the way, Wayne, we're going to record this presentation for possible future inclusion in a documentary." And I looked at them and I thought, thank you guys. I was looking for a bit of extra pressure. I really appreciate that. But thankfully, straight after the meeting, they gave me immediate approval to proceed. They said, yes, your concept is great and it's totally on track with what we want. So the whole project almost immediately became a mechanical one. The general concept had been settled. It's just a matter of applying this concept to a typeface. And so as we go through that long mechanical stage in typeface development, legibility becomes a critical driving factor for many of the remaining design decisions. As an example, I chose Gil Sans on the left there, designed way back in the 1930s, and compared 4 particular characters with what I've done on the right. So Gil Sans on the left, those 4 letters from left to right are capital I, lowercase l, and the numeral 1. And you can see how 3 out of those 4, and at small sizes even the 4th, could easily be visually confused with each other. Can you imagine using Gil Sans in passwords in this day and age, for instance? So my legibility features among the font were things like a little crossbar on the top of the I, a hook base on the L, and another horizontal bar on the top of the number 1. Some alternative versions of the 1 had a baseline bar as well. And that's just some of the many legibility features built into this font to try and make sure that it's as recognizable and functional as possible. But that wasn't the only thing that I had to deal with. The ABC has a mandate to provide content that is as accessible and non-discriminatory as possible, and that includes people with, for instance, reading disabilities such as dyslexia. And mirror image letters can be a real problem for people with certain forms of dyslexia. There are many mirror image letters throughout the lowercase alphabet, and here's just a couple of example pairs. So our solution was to produce the spurs on the top of the letters on P and Q, and also B and D at the baseline to make sure that they're a little bit different from each other, to help try and distinguish visually these letters, or find other ways of distinguishing them other than their orientation. Same applies with U and N on the right there. The place where the bowl joins the stem was different, and the size of the spur was different, and the overall width of the 2 letters was a little bit different as well. All of this culminated in an entire day spent at the ABC's offices in Sydney with the design team, where we put large copies of each letter up on the wall and discussed them in forensic detail and drew on them, and then I would make adjustments in my font software and upload a beta version to the web so that they could test the font in live content. And you can see on the left there we had a table that was overflowing with devices, as many different kinds and operating systems and sizes as we could to be able to test this all out. And all of this was just to reach a conclusion on the basic regular weight of the typeface, which is the second one from the top there. So when that was ultimately approved, all of those design decisions encapsulated in that regular weight were then translated to other weights, the light, the bold, and the black. And furthering on from that, some specialty weights such as an italic, the bold condensed. Second from the top there is being used nowadays for display purposes primarily. There are also 2 rounded weights that were used for children's programming that were based on the same DNA of the original font. So in April 2018, this new graphic identity was launched with my font in it, and I just turned on my television one morning on the ABC 24 news channel to see my font suddenly as part of this new identity, which was very much a surreal experience. I'll just play you a quick video that shows how the fonts were built into as part of this kind of graphic identity.
Now let's talk sport. Georgie Tunney joins us.
He's known in Afghanistan as the man who has helped 100,000 people walk again.
Some breaking news has just come in. The ABC.
Good morning and welcome to News Breakfast.
Know the story.
Know the story.
So around 12 months after that, the ABC's primary news and entertainment channel, ABC One, also had a brand overhaul that involved the use of the ABC Sans fonts as well. And this was very fascinating for me too, because it was the first chance I got to see the fonts in use outside of a news context. Part of the original brief to me was we want this font to have a newsy tone, but not so serious that it can't be used for entertainment and general purpose use as well. And so this is where it's started to be rolled out in Australia's and the ABC's wider kind of branding. Nowadays, it's been a couple of years now beyond that point, and the ABC Sans is at the centre of every single piece of branding that the ABC does. So what's been the response since it's been out there? People often ask me this. Well, it's been overwhelmingly positive, but it did generate some controversy at the time. On the left is a conservative commentator named Chris Kenny, and on his segment, he had a segment complaining that the ABC was wasting taxpayer dollars by creating a corporate font all of their own. He said in his segment, and I quote, Times New Roman, sorry, he actually said New Times Roman or Comic Sans, none of that's good enough for the ABC. So he didn't even have enough research to quote the name of Times New Roman properly. On the right is James Patterson, who's a senator from Victoria, Australia, also from the conservative side of politics, who in a Senate estimates hearing was questioning the spending of this money on a font, and basically said the same thing, what's wrong with an off-the-shelf font, which is what ABC had been using for many decades before that. And well, what's wrong with an off-the-shelf font is the fact that you pay licensing for those fonts for a large number of employees in the many multiples of thousands. And in some cases, with some of those fonts, that licensing is payable on an annual basis. So the part of the ABC's motivation for doing this was to produce a font that they had exclusive ownership over and would only have to pay for once. So I like to think that I did my bit for the national budget. Just to wrap it up, here's some stats about the project. It went over a roughly 18-month period. There were 11 fonts in the set ultimately. There were 21 number of betas. That means every time I had to make a change and then send it back to get approved, it would create a new beta version of the font for testing. 4,345 individually vectored characters. Yay, that was fun. There are upwards of 30,000 kerning pairs across all of the fonts, and the destination screens somewhere north of 20 million, who knows, possibly way more than that. An awful lot to make sure that it performs on every single possible screen. In conclusion, well, a job like this is once in a lifetime, once in a career, and it was an absolute privilege to work on. The collaborative experience with the design team at ABC was nothing short of fantastic, and the ultimate outcome, I think, owes as much to them as it does to myself. The big question is, does it contain the national character? Well, how do you judge that? There's no way of measuring that. I like to think that since I grew up with the ABC, watching it every day, and since I'm, an Australian, then the font might be infused with a certain Aussiness. But I'm really interested in people's comment about that from both Australians and others from overseas. So I just wanted to say thank you for listening. If you do want to know more detail, there's a web address on screen that shows a case study, a detailed case study. And please go ahead and Please go ahead and follow me on Instagram. There's my Instagram handle at the bottom of the screen there. And thank you for listening.
Hi, this is Rafael Casas, and I'm presenting to you Evolving Baybayin Text Typeface Design Principles. Baybayin's a representative script of the Philippines. Although this one's primarily associated with the Tagalogs, this script has been used by other ethnic groups in the Philippines like the Ilocanos, the Visayans, and the Bicolanos. Some of its better known relatives are the Palava script, the Kawi script, which is also a marker of our history, and the Sumatra-Sulawesi scripts, in which the Buginese and Old Makassar scripts are members of this family. The first Philippine script specimen is the Kalatagan pot inscription. According to research, these have shown to be something like a prayer pot, meant to be read by a shaman. The second specimen here shows Don Dionisio Capulong's signature for land deed. The third specimen shows a first printout of Baybayin, dated 1593. So in here, you see that there's a bit of a different order as compared to what you see right now. The fourth specimen here shows a Ra specimen. This one is specifically from Zambales. The fifth one shows a new innovation for Baybayin script, which is the Cruz Kudlit. This one was released in 1621. Baybayin has a lot of theories of origin. A lot of them are quite disputed due to scarcity of evidence, and also because the materials written are not exactly permanent. So we get to have a lot of gaps when it comes to history. But so far, what I've posted in here are the more acceptable theories here. One of the first ones is out of Kawi. Then another would be out of Sumatra and Sulawesi. Later, you will get to see the evidence of the relatedness. In here, this map shows a diagram on how the script might have traveled from India to the Philippines. So first, it came from South India to Java as Kawi and Palava. Next, it may have evolved to Sumatra and Sulawesi. Then from Sulawesi, it went to Sulu, then to Manila. Then from Manila, it went to Visayas. This one was recorded by a friar named Father Alcina. So in here, we have the timeline from 1465 to today. So let's start with the signature or handwriting in Baybayin. This was the time when the script was still widely used. In this specimen of Doctrina Christiana, the basic characters are highlighted in red. You also have here the Ra And we also have here the Cruz Kudlit, where my cursor is at. The script has evolved to a lot of places in the Philippines, like in Palawan, where we have Tagbanwa. This script is the most similar in form to Baybayin, so they have parallels in other Southeast Asian countries, in Indonesia, where Javanese and Balinese have the same similarity, and we also have Thai and Lao. Then we have here Buhid and Hanuno'o. The forms here became angular due to the constraints of the bamboo and the blades. And they also developed ligatures with dependent vowels. We also have here Kulitan, which is a derived Kapampangan script. Unlike most scripts in the Philippines, it has a subscript, consonant set, and a vowel lengthener. The script looked like it had a bright future, but unfortunately, due to social mobility, the locals decided to learn Latin script instead of their own. Another reason for the decline was due to the debate on the innovations that were placed in there. All hope is not lost, since there are a few other people who took a decision to publish a magazine in Baybayin script, like Panitik Silangan. Then in 1994, the script went to the photo typesetting world. And this one's also the first attempt to separate Da and Ra. And then there are some other style explorations here, like what Norman de los Santos, also known as Nordenks, did. Then here's another counterfactual design exercise where Baybayin was used instead of the Latin script. This one makes for a rather fun design exercise, and it's also a visionary one if you get to check the opinions of other designers. And we have here Noto Sans Tagalog by Frederick Brennan. In here we have the first order where we have the vowels, and then we have the old order in here where my cursor is at, and on the right hand side we have the Brahmic order. In this slide we have here the Indonesian and Philippine scripts. What the designer did here, Bayu, was that what he did in here was that he designed related scripts together so that it would represent unity in Indonesia. But a lot of Philippine scripts happen to have some design principles and elements that sort of fit with the Indonesian scripts. In this section, we're going to talk about style classification. This is just one of the many ways to make Baybayin relevant today. So we have here DSS classification. Norden's classification. This is actually one of the first attempts to bring Baybayin to the digital era. There are many other ways to classify it aside from what they've shown, because one of the criticisms that their work could have is that they're closely based with Vox's A-type classification system. This year, A-type has withdrawn their endorsement for this system because it was a flawed system, and a lot of forms ended up conforming to the Latin ones, even the foreign types. Now, we're showing you some alternatives. The first would be the additive models and the subtractive models. Now, for the additive model, we have here Nordsize stroke of the pen theory. So there are two main ways to do it, by translation or by expansion. In the translation tool, it requires a flat or oval tip, allowing the thicknesses to change within certain angles generated by lateral hand movement of the tool. So with this, you have here Certo, Antioch Bible, Adobe Arabic, then Brioso in Latin, Lazursky in Cyrillic, Khmer pen Surin for Khmer, and Chuli for Thai. For the expansion set, we have here Dido, HT Elias, and Heisei Mincho Thai. So it needs a noodler's pen or a flexible pointed pen here, or a brush. For the subtractive model, the negative forms get to be more focused in here, just as what this process shows here. We have here Willemans theory in covering whites. So do not apply black but cover up whites so as to activate the light on the sheet of the paper. So you get to see a world of difference between Frutiger and Myriad Pro. Then Fred Myers would focus on the counters here. He simply says, draw the counterforms first. In the Hiwa, the Ethiopian tends to focus on the white spaces, so it gets to give a certain kind of readability. Notan also shows how your form would maintain a certain kind of integrity right after you play around with it. These negative space theories are often done on the later phases of typeface design. So we have here Galliard, Quadrat, Tegaro, and Icom. In here, there's a mini theory of design principles for Southeast Asian index scripts. So the graphical types tend to be in either circular type, just like this Mon Burmesian script sample is in here, we have the angular type like the Sundanese and Hanuno'o. And then we have the noodle type scripts, in which a lot of Southeast Asian scripts tend to be representative, like Thai, Lao, Khmer, Balinese, Javanese, Baybayin, and Tagbanwa. So, for Latin typeface designers, if you get to design Cyrillic and Greek, you actually have a starting point for noodle and angular type Southeast Asian scripts. All you need to do is to learn how to respect the ductus of the local scripts. So in here, there are certain ways to iterate. In this presentation, I simply explored how the 1621 Baybayin was made. The inference I was able to have was that they use a certain stylus and palm leaf first before imitating the forms and carving this to the printing press negatives. In this exercise, what I was able to find was that the horizontals are thicker and the elements are curvilinear. And these ducti match. So given this, I experimented with another translation tool. What I did in here was that I used the Lontara and bamboo form. Then I did some modifications on the third set here. And on the second set, what I attempted to do is to make the forms a little more edgy. The same goes in here. And then we also have here ways on how to express certain independent vowels, dependent vowels, and the viramas. There are actually three options: the kruskudlit, the ekis, and the pamudput. So what I found in the experiment was that thick horizontals are recommended, but there are actually exceptions to the rule. You have the ka, ha, and the top bar of e independent vowel. In there, you actually can use the Latin contrast or simply follow the 60 to 80 degree contrast. So based on what we've explored in these forms, we came to a similar conclusion that Baybayin can be modularized into entry strokes, wave strokes, flow strokes, cloud strokes, river strokes, and fall strokes. So this is what happened after the experiment. In here, I matched here the italic and the Baybayin forms. This one was an entry for Damakolahiko. So if you want to properly encode Philippine scripts for Baybayin, you need to use U plus 1700 plus U171F. Now, for Unicode 14, there are 3 more glyphs added. 170D, which is the Ra, 1715, which is the pamudpud, and 171F, which is the archaic ra. For Tagbanwa, they have their own forms. Same with Buhid, Hanunoo, and for now, the Kulitan's still hanging because for now, it's still a proposal. So where do we go from here? Or how do we modernize without losing its genius loci, for lack of a better word? So under the Philippine law, the National Writing and System Act of 2014 defines Baybayin as all existing and discovered ancient and traditional scripts of the Philippine indigenous people. However, I usually prefer Suyat due to its inclusivity. So for now, Baybayin is used in paper bills, passports, and some government insignia. So given all of these details, it's still a work in progress, and given some rules and exceptions, all I can say is that apply your design elements judiciously. You can actually try to attempt Latin, Greek, Khmer, and Thai elements as long as you know how to harmonize them, which for now is quite a tough job. If you'd like to continue this, feel free to refer to this presentation and make an inspiration out of this, or be inspired by this, or even criticize my work. Thank you so much for your time, and now we're open for question and answer.
Hi, Olivia.
Hey, Micah.
Hi, Steph.
Hi, Micah.
And hi, everybody. We are the League of Movable Type, the first open source font foundry. You might know us from the weekly typographic podcast and newsletter, but we're coming to you live from TypeWknd this weekend. I'm Micah. I'm joining you from New York State.
I'm Olivia. I'm joining you from Brooklyn, New York.
And I'm Steph, and I'm joining you from Melbourne, Australia.
And we are here to share a few of our favorite talks that we loved and give you a couple that you can look forward to tomorrow. What a first day.
Very
Totally.
Cool. Olivia, do you want to kick us off and tell us what some of your favorites were?
Yeah, absolutely. Really interesting. You know, I watched TypeWknd last year, and this year it just continues to impress. So the first talk I wanted to talk about was Navigating the Process, Research Methodologies for Designing in Non-Native Scripts by Natalie Snodgrass. Overall, it's a great deep dive into the very extensive process of designing an unfamiliar or non-native script. I think a thing that more and more type designers are being tasked with these days. So very topical, very relevant. It really kind of looks at typography from an anthropological point of view. So talking about how typography carries constructed meanings of culture and, you know, how it's important if you are designing a script for a culture that you're not aware of, that you really do your research. In a survey of designers that, you know, design for non-native scripts, they said that oftentimes designing for a non-native script meant 90% research for your complete time and then 10% designing. A crazy fact that I thought was super relevant. Lots of great, beautiful gems within this talk. And then there was a couple other talks that stood out to me that examined bringing historical letter forms design to life that I found interesting. The first one was Enrico Martínez, Un rescate tipográfico del México, novohipano by Pedro Sosa. And hopefully I got the pronunciation right. And the second one was Calligraphic Typesetting, Exploration of Religious Scriptures to Resurrect the Emotional and Spiritual Connection originally existed in the traditional penmanship by Abhay Verma. Both of these focused on, you know, historical letter forms. The first one was about Enrico Martínez, not someone that's necessarily in traditional type and history design textbooks, but was a very influential designer and printer and master of all trades and in Mexico and America. And so Pedro worked on a revival of this type in a really beautiful process video showing all the steps that he took to kind of maintain its integrity. And then Abhay Verma talked about digitization of calligraphy from a religious scripture. And aside from the letter forms, he talks about how print and production methodologies can really impact the effect of the final product and how successful it is at recreating a period in time. So both projects, I think, highlighted works that we're not going to find in our typical type and design history, and I really appreciated that.
I love that. That is fun. That is interesting. All right, shoot, Steph, you're up.
So a couple of the talks I really enjoyed today was, first up was Designing a Feminist Devangari Typeface by Shriti Mitra. And one of the things I loved about this was she was inspired by the UN Sustainable Development Goals, and particularly goal number 5, which is around equality for all genders and across the gender spectrum as well. And she talked about how the type characteristics we often talk about have got a real masculine or feminine connotation to them, and how we maybe need to move away from that and can challenge that and question that as we're designing typefaces, but also when we're using typefaces as designers in our designs. So one of the things that was really interesting about this is that in Devangari script, there's lots of curves and there's no serifs actually as well. So some of those characteristics that we talk about when it comes to Latin typefaces change quite a lot when it comes to different scripts, which was really interesting to me as I wasn't familiar with Devangari script. Some of the different weights that she then talks about as well also had different masculine and feminine connotations. So she actually went and did a bit of a survey around and some study around what type of characteristics, what type of typefaces did people see as more masculine and more feminine, and then starting to boil that down into the specific elements of that. And then she developed a typeface that brought some of those together and actually really almost 50-50 matched the masculine and the feminine elements of those characteristics into a typeface then that was a lot more neutral and could have maybe different ways of describing it, which I thought was really interesting and something that we've been talking about obviously at the League quite recently. It's come up on a couple of episodes just even in the last few weeks as well. The other one I really enjoyed, which actually links to really nicely to one, Olivia, you were just talking about, is Balancing Type Design with Language Learning by Michelle Devlin. And she was talking about how you can learning typography, but also learning the language at the same time. And I think the key point from that I found really interesting was when you're learning the language as well as learning the script and the system, you start to see more than just the abstract shapes of the letter forms and of the characters and of the glyphs, etc. They start to mean something a little bit more. So it was a real reminder that if you are ever developing a typeface and you are bringing in different characters or addressing the typeface design so that you can include different scripts, it's important to actually understand the context of those scripts rather than just them as abstract shapes. Micah, what were your favorites?
Well, I actually had two favorites from today. They were two very interesting and very different talks. The first was Letters from Home. And it was this like beautifully creative, artistic effort to both find and create Punjabi scripts from everyday things in the speaker's life. It was very human, and she kind of described it as like the project. She used the words honest and uncluttered, which I thought was very interesting. And she had some history that was super interesting about Northwest, South Indian writing systems and kind of like some of the differences in those different cultures. So the speaker, her name was Amrit. She was very intelligent, and I think she said she was 17 years old and doing these like beautiful, creative, deep artistic projects, which I just thought was amazing. And she did an amazing job too of animating visuals to go along with her talk. So I think, she's talking mostly here about like the different scripts in Indian cultures, and it's kind of both through history and geography. And sort of her main point is that like homogenizing these things into one Indian script is not really helpful for anybody. And there's a lot of beauty in the differences, which I just thought was really cool, and so cool that she was like so young and so well-spoken and did such a great job. And then my other favorite talk, totally different side of the spectrum, the talk was called The Research of Tool Making Towards Intuitive Variable Font Specimens. It was kind of technical, and it was pretty detailed. And so it was sort of, this team had already designed a very complex variable font with a ton of different axes and like different directions that it could go. And they wanted to make sort of a specimen that did that justice. And so they made this like super interactive tool where you could sort of click into things and make decisions and like move around in this imaginary space to discover the different variations. And in that, the speaker, Roni, was talking about kind of their thought process in how to do this. And she made a super interesting point that the problems of too much choice are starting to seep into the space of variable fonts, because the tweaking options for variations are limitless. And so we kind of need to start designing UIs to enable playing with that without feeling like we have too much choice. I thought that was a very interesting point. And she also made the point too that like designing for experts is very different than designing for casual users. And in this case, like designing for designers, they're experts. And so designers are coming in with sort of like pre-made preferences and more desire for options than a casual user or a normal human would want, but still have that same problem of too much choice comes with paralysis. So it was a really interesting, detailed case study, how they sort of built this interactive site and the thoughts behind it. I thought that was pretty darn cool.
We're already seeing a really interesting theme around the globalization of typography. I feel like we all travel to different parts of the world with all of our different perspectives and favorite videos. So I know that's going to continue as the days go by, but already exciting that we're hearing all these new different perspectives. I think that's a beautiful thing about TypeWknd.
And it's so cool that there's like such an interesting mix of super detailed and technical with like historical and geographical and sort of fun and playful. It's a really awesome variety.
And while we're talking about going around the world, I do have to give a special notice or mention to Wayne Thompson from Australia, who does a talk actually today in day one around creating your country's national font. And that was a really interesting talk about creating a font for the national broadcaster here in Australia.
That's pretty cool.
I really liked that one.
It's good. It was really good.
All right, so Steph, give us a tease of what some of your favorites are tomorrow that we can talk about.
Tomorrow, a similar theme, looking forward to going around the world. So going to Morocco tomorrow, going over to India again, going to look through some trash as well. So looking forward to a couple of those, particularly the one around creating from Kupai by Jayashree Sridhar, who is talking about finding typography treats in trash.
All right, Olivia, what are you excited about tomorrow?
Oh, there's a couple I'm super psyched about. The first one is Fonts for Video Games, Overlooked and Underserved by Justin Penner. That's so fascinating. I don't even know how the heck fonts work in video games. Like, please tell me. Excited about that one. And then also really excited about All Set, about characters, glyphs, and which set to include in your font from Nina Bothoff. Sounds very neat.
That's cool. All right, I've got a couple too. I mean, I'm very excited about one called An Oasis of Type, which was kind of like examining Indian culture and making typography with kind of the oppressive nature of Western modernism, which was pretty intense and pretty cool. And then there's definitely one that I'm going to mention tomorrow about faux Indian scripts that are Latin, that look like Indian, and it's sort of like the Comic Sans of India. It's going to be interesting.
That sounds very cool.
Love it.
All right, hope everybody had an awesome day, and we will catch you tomorrow. Doodle-a-doot.
Doodle-a-doot.